Hey everyone, it is Chris, and today we are going to finish off the damage series that I've been working on for months, and I've done lots and lots and lots of math, and I've talked about the damage potential of the various classes and character options, and then 2024 rules, and punch math on them and graph them. And today we're going to talk about the damage potential in Tier 4. And Tier 4 is level 17 through 20, so this is the very end, and a lot of campaigns will never get this far. But if you do get this far, you probably do want to know who's going to end up on top. You might play one-shots also in Tier 4. Sometimes I do, and they're a lot of fun. They're very, very different. And which classes do the best damage definitely changes from lower levels. So we're going to go through based on 39 builds that I punch math for from levels 1 through 20, and I'll let you know which ones did best in these levels. And then after that, what I want to do is talk about baseline. So I always use a baseline, and I just called it baseline, but it was a warlock baseline based on a warlock using Eldritch Blast and Agonizing Blast and Hex. And I would graph it, and then I would compare builds and their damage potential to the warlock baseline, because the warlock baseline is what I consider to be kind of the minimum okay damage. So if you met the baseline, you're doing okay for damage. Not, a great damage dealer, but you would feel like you were contributing, just like a Warlock does with Agonizing Blast and Eldritch Blast. However, in the 2024 rules, I'm not sure a Warlock with Eldritch Blast really is going to feel like they're contributing at all levels anymore. There's just too much damage potential built into everybody now, including Warlocks. So I'm going to discuss what my new baseline is going to be and why. All right, and I will finish it up with, I think it was 5 videos ago, I did an overall ranking of every class, and I just threw out a number, and I said I would have to explain where that number came from later on. Today I'm going to explain where that number came from. Okay, so let's get through it here. We're going to start with just how the builds performed in Tier 4, and I'm going to start with what I call base builds, and base builds are builds that do not have a subclass. So this is how your class you would expect it to do if you took a subclass that didn't really increase your damage. Or maybe it increases it, but just a little bit. Then this is going to give you a pretty close indication of how you would function in Tier 4. Now, what I'm going to put up on your screen right now are how I'm going to rank these. So you can see A through D, and you see at the bottom end of D, one of these builds only does 35 points of damage a round. In Tier 4, that's terrible damage. Absolutely awful. And then at the top of the ranks, we have A, and it has up to 79 points of damage. In other words, that's the highest average damage I got to with Tier 4 builds, not using Conjure Minor Elementals, because Conjure Minor Elementals has a break in it. It's just one of those things that you need to deal with at your own table. Just know that if you got Conjure Minor Elementals and multiple attacks, you can outdamage everything if you use the upcasting as it's written. And I will also ask, if you are not subscribed, to please subscribe. I am pushing for 100,000. I'm really, really, really close. So if you would subscribe, I'd really appreciate it if you aren't already subscribed. Okay, so let's go through. First, we're going to go through the base builds, which are no subclass. Now, keep in mind, in Tier 4, the difference between having a subclass that adds to damage and not having a subclass that adds to damage has become very, very large. In fact, we will see some subclasses add as much as 30 to the average DPR, and it is not uncommon for it to be 15 to 20. So for base builds at this point, it is tough. It is tough if you didn't take a subclass that adds to your damage. No matter what class you chose, there's a good chance you're going to struggle. And we're going to see this here. We're going to start with two-handed melee, and we begin with the Ranger using Hunter's Mark and 2-weapon fighting. Is at 37. That's way, way down in D tier. And then we have the Ranger base face Summoner 2-weapon fighter. So if we try to replace Hunter's Mark with Summon Fae, we do a little more damage at 44. That's 7 higher, but we're still well into D tier. Then, yes, a little surprisingly, Paladins have hit D tier at this point, but this is base Paladin. So a Paladin base Greatsword. So if you choose Oath of Glory or Oath of Ancients, you can have trouble dealing damage in tier 4. You really kind of need Devotion or Vengeance. And you'll see that both, or that Oath of Vengeance at least, which I punch math for, does a lot better than this. But yeah, without a subclass that's adding to your damage, you can struggle in tier 4 for damage. And then, also somewhat surprisingly, Barbarian base Greatsword has fallen to D tier. So that means if you are choosing a Wild Heart Barbarian or a World Tree Barbarian, in tier 4 your damage is not going to be good. It's going to be bad damage. You have to choose one of the subclasses that adds to damage if you want to be relevant with damage in tier 4 with a Barbarian. They just don't get enough between 11 and 20 unless their subclass is giving them something. We will then go to C tier, and we're going to begin with the Monk base 2-weapon fighter. So this was a monk that used 2 daggers and the weapon mastery feat to get the Nick property. And we got to 51. So we're at the point where the damage isn't too bad. So if you want to play a monk that isn't adding to your damage, I think we can add to damage with open hand in tier 4 because of the way Quivering Palm has changed. Elements Monk definitely adds to damage. Mercy Monk adds to damage. You would have to be playing one of the older versions, one of the non-player. I think if you choose any player's handbook Monk subclass, you should be able to beat this number. But there are older versions that wouldn't beat this number. 51, which is the low end of okay. Then we have the Warlock base Blade Pact Greatsword. Goes all the way up to 59. That's not bad. So you can play pretty much any Warlock you want with a Greatsword and do okay damage, pretty much at any level. And then we get to our top of two-handed melee in tier 4, and that's the Fighter. That shouldn't be a surprise. They get their 4th attack, and they get up to 63, and that gets them to B tier. There's only 2 base builds that made B tier, and that's one of them. Then we're going to talk about base one-handed melee, and so from the top of two-handed to the bottom of one-handed, we have the Fighter. If they use a longsword, it's only 41. So that's well into D tier. But we can get into B tier with the Warlock base true, or a C tier with the Warlock base True Strike Shillelagh. Then we can get up to 52, which is near the bottom of C tier, but it is C tier. So that's True Strike, 1 attack, add Agonizing Blast. Now let's talk about ranged. So if we want to do ranged damage, we can do it with spells, we can do it with weapons. We're going to compare them all to each other here. The worst damage that I did for tier 4 is the Bard with 35. They're trying to use spells to keep up, but they don't have any special ability to make their spells better. They can choose any spell, or pretty much any spell, not every spell. But they just have no class features to really make them better, and no class features to get spell slots back, and they suffer for it, and it's 35. And then we have the Ranger base Hunter's Mark with a longbow. Just isn't cutting it at 44. And then the Rogue base Dagger Thrower. So this is a rogue that uses 2 daggers and throws them. And this did okay damage in earlier tiers, but it doesn't hold up in tier 4. So it also falls behind D tier 45. Now we're going to talk about some C tiers. And first we're going to talk about a 3-way tie. So this is all C tier. We have the Druid with spells. We have the Warlock with Eldritch Blast. And we have the Rogue using a light crossbow and True Strike. They all do about 54 points of damage, which is okay in tier 4. And if you don't have a subclass that adds to damage, that's not bad. And then our best range damage in tier 4, and this is the best base build damage. So this is the best damage you can get without a subclass that's adding to your damage from all the builds that I looked at. The Sorcerer base blast spells build at 65. So finally, we see spells coming out ahead, but you do need a way to boost them. The Sorcerer's got meta magic. The Sorcerer's got innate sorcery. That makes them a whole lot better at casting their offensive spells than a Bard. And to the point where it is close to double the damage. Okay, so that is all the base builds. Let's talk about the optimized builds. So these are ones that include a subclass. and a subclass that is going to add to damage, though they don't all add the same amount. But we're going to begin with optimized two-handed melee, and we have a ton of A's here. Just a ton of A's. But first, we have a couple C's to go through. We're going to start with a Fey Wanderer Summoner, two-weapon fighter, so Rangers can get okay damage with two-weapon fighting in Tier 4, but it is the low end of okay damage. Okay? And then College of Valor Greatsword is 55. Bards struggle for damage. College of Valor helps, can get you into okay damage in Tier 4. And this is a build that suffered at earlier levels, so it's good to at least see it get to C tier in the end. Then we have a few B tiers, and we're going to start with a Zealot with a Greatsword. So this is a Zealot Barbarian. Does exceptional in Tier 2. It's second highest of any build in Tier 2. Now it's well behind, but it's still pretty decent damage. 60 damage is not bad at all. I mean, we cap out at 78 damage, so 60 damage is okay. Then we get to the Warrior of Shadow, two-weapon fighter, gets up to 63. And then the Oath of Vengeance, dex-based two-weapon fighter at 66. Does pretty good damage. Now, everything else in two-handed melee, and we what 2, 4, 6, 7 builds reached A tier in two-handed melee. It is by far, if you want to do the most damage in 2024 rules, consider two-handed melee. We begin with Berserker Greatsword at 71. So yes, the Barbarian without a subclass using a Greatsword is in D tier in Tier 4, but the Berserker adds so much, it brings it up to A tier. That's how much difference a good subclass can make. Next, Psy Warrior Greatsword gets us up to 72. Then we're going to have two tied builds, and that is the Fiend Patron Greatsword focused on Charisma, and the Fiend Patron Greatsword focused on Strength. They're both 73. Basically what happens is the Fiend Patron Warlock who focuses on Strength first can take the feats they want earlier on. But eventually, the Charisma-based Warlock can take those feats too, once they get the Charisma up to 20. And so by Tier 4, it makes no difference in terms of damage, which means you definitely want to do Charisma because there's other benefits to having a higher Charisma. So yeah, 73. Then we're going to get up to 75 with the Eldritch Knight using a Greatsword. Fighters and Greatswords do well. Psy Warrior Greatsword was also A tier. Then, remember the Paladin was in D tier with a Greatsword? Well, if you are Oath of Vengeance Paladin with a Greatsword, you're A tier at 76. But the highest two-handed melee damage in Tier 4 is the Circle of the Moon Druid at 77, where you can combine spells along with that melee, and we get up to 77 damage, which is very high. It's not the highest damage that we're going to see, but it is very close. Now let's talk about one-handed melee. So this is, you want a hand free so that maybe you can wear a shield or do grappling or something like that. What you don't want to do is be a fighter and do a longsword, because fighters plus longswords do not do good damage. The Battlemaster longsword at 48 at the bottom, D tier. Then the Zealot longsword at 49. So Zealot Barbarians do great damage in Tier 2, but doesn't hold up. And if you're using a Greatsword, you can still do good damage in Tier 4, but not with a longsword. Then we're going to have the Oath of Vengeance longsword at 57, so Paladins can do okay with a sword and shield even in Tier 4. Then we have the Berserker with a longsword at 58, same thing. Barbarian can do okay with a longsword, but you have to take Berserker. Zealot doesn't even do it anymore. And you're still only going to get to C tier. Then we have a B tier, and that's the Celestial Patron True Strike Shillelagh. So this was a novelty build, but in Tier 4 it does pretty good. 65, good damage. Does not have good damage in lower tiers. So this is something I might consider for a one-shot, just to do something kind of cool and different. I probably wouldn't do this for like a campaign. But we are going to have a couple A tiers, even with one-handed melee. The first is the Champion using a Shillelagh. Gets to 71. And then they are beaten by the Eldritch Knight with a Shillelagh at 78. The Champion outdamaged the Eldritch Knight in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. But here in tier 4, the Eldritch Knight has pulled out ahead. That's, I guess, what spells do for you. And then we're going to talk about ranged. Okay, so at the low end of ranged, we have a C tier, the only C tier in ranged for optimized, and that is the Beastmaster Longbow at 52. Beastmaster does add to damage, so if you take Beastmaster, you will take the lousy ranger damage and you'll bring it up to okay. I think you could play this and not feel too bad. But we're going to have 3 B tiers. And we start with the Archfey Patron, Eldritch Blast at 61. Then the Draconic Sorcerer Blast build and the Assassin Heavy Crossbow, which are tied at 68. So if you want to do range damage and you want to focus on it and you're going to get right to tier 4, the Sorcerer is one you might consider, but it is a late bloomer. Just be aware that at earlier levels it didn't perform all that well. The Assassin kind of hits it from levels 1 through 20. It just seems to do good damage regardless of the level that you are. So that is something that I would probably recommend if you want to focus on single target damage. So, how did they do as classes? Well, if we're looking at the base classes and the best you can do with them, so this is not including a subclass, there they are up on your screen. The best you can do is the Sorcerer. And this is the first time the Sorcerer has been at number 1. And then number 2 is the Fighter, which is not far behind the Sorcerer. Only 2 points difference. So Fighter, Sorcerer, good choices if you're not going to worry too much about your subclass. Then we have the Warlock at 59. Then the Rogue and the Druid are tied at 54. Then the Monk is at 51. And these are basically the classes that, if you don't worry about your subclass, can do okay damage. For Barbarian, Paladin, Ranger, and Bard, you have to increase that damage with a subclass. If you don't, these are the numbers you can expect, and they're not good. And I should just mention how much the various subclasses kind of added to damage. All right, I'm re-recording this bit because I screwed it up the first time. But if we were talking about subclasses and how much they added to damage, if you took Oath of Vengeance Paladin, that increases your two-handed damage by 30 damage around in tier 4. That's the most. Followed by, there's a tie with the Berserker for two-handed damage, is plus 23. And Circle of the Moon Druid. Now you have to go from range to melee, but you do increase your damage by 23. Then we have the College of Valor, which again, you got to go from range to two-handed melee, but you can get 20 extra points of damage. Eldritch Knights, using one-handed, can add 15. Fiend Patron, two-handed, can add 14. Assassin at range can add 14 to rogues. Zealots can add plus 12 to two-handed. Warrior of Shadow can add plus 12 to two-handed. So these are some pretty big numbers. Now, some of the subclasses I added didn't add much to damage at all. Like the Draconic Sorcerer added 3. So I'm not listing it here. But if you look at these subclasses, obviously I didn't do a universal subclass build DPR. And I may get there in the years to follow, but there's a lot of different ways you can build characters. But you can just see how much damage it ends up being at the end of a 20-level career if you take a subclass that increases your damage. In my overall rankings video, where did the numbers came from? Well, I had these numbers for each of the tiers, and what I did is tier 1, I added it in. Tier 4, I added it in. Tier 3, I multiplied it by 2 and added it in, and Tier 2, I multiplied it by 3 and added it in. So I kind of weighted the various tiers to the tiers I figured saw the most play. So that's how that worked. And now that you've actually seen the numbers and know what they all mean, hopefully that means something as well. So if you go back and watch that video and you see these numbers, 200 and whatever, that's where they came from. I added Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and Tier 4 together, except I multiplied Tier 2 by 3, and I multiplied Tier 3 by 2. Okay, so baseline. So what you should be able to see up on your screen right now are a bunch of builds and a bunch of numbers below the builds. And the numbers have colors. And they might not come through super clear because often Google Docs, when you use the colors, they don't show up great on video. But that's okay. It's unnecessary for this. What we can see from this is how each of these builds does in each tier of play. So for example, here's Circle of the Moon. We can see yellow in tier 1, red in tier 2, green in tier 3, and then blue in tier 4. So what that tells me is the Circle of the Moon does okay at very low levels, but in tier 2 they really struggle. But once you get through tier 2, then you do pretty good damage, and it goes up to great damage by the end of tier 4. So that's kind of the cycle you're going to go through if you play Circle of the Moon. Well, we've got the Fey Wanderer Summoner. This is a ranger. We can see in tier 1 they do great, and then every other level they do okay. Fey Wanderer and summoning helps enough that, the ranger isn't in the dumps, but it is near the lower ends. And then, we can just go through the various builds. We can see Berserker is blue all the way from 1 through 20. It's the only build that is. No other build was blue at every single level of play. The Berserker was the highest damage that I saw of all the builds I did. And that was 39 builds. And we can see here the Eldritch Knight starts out slow, and then it builds up, and by tier 4 it's doing really well. And yeah, so you're going to just see that there's a big variety of colors based on which build we look at, unless I go right back to the beginning. Oh, and look at this. The Ranger Base Hunter's Mark and Hail of Thorns Longbow is red from 1 through 20. And the same with the base Bard Spells build. But I'm just going to go back up to the top, and here we go. Warlock Base Blade Pack Greatsword. Yellow, 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 yellow. Tier scores 8, 24, 37, and 59. These are C tier for all 4 tiers, meaning they do okay damage, but not great damage at every level of play. And so, the Warlock Base Blade Packed Greatsword is going to be my next baseline. It is the only build that was C tier in all 4 tiers. And so, ironically, I guess, is it ironic that we're going to still be a Warlock, just a different Warlock? Because, yeah, my old baseline was a Warlock. It just used Eldritch Blast. So we're going to stick with Warlock. We're just going to change our weapon. We're going to switch from Eldritch Blast to using a Greatsword and Blade Pact. And I want to show you the different sonograph. So there they are next to each other, and the one that is the top line all the way from level 1 through 20 is the Greatsword. So this bottom red line is using Eldritch Blast, and yeah, we can see we've just increased our baseline just by a touch in tier 1, by a fair amount in tier 2, by a lot in tier 3, and by less in tier 4, but this is the modified Eldritch Blast, by the way, I should mention. I did throw Foresight on the Eldritch Blast user with a recent revision, but we're beating that as well. So we're going to have a higher baseline than we used to, but I do think this represents decent but not overwhelming damage. And it does jump at pretty much the right spots. The only part of this that I'm not totally thrilled with is right here at level 11, because the Blade Pack Greatsword does not see the big jump at level 11. Instead, it sees a big jump at level 12. That's a level later than I would normally expect. I don't think that's a big deal. If we're looking at level 11 damage alone, it might make a big deal, but I tend not to do that. So, yeah, I think this new baseline is going to work well. The only issue is I can't just call it the Warlock baseline, because people won't know which Warlock I'm talking about. So we'll maybe call it the Blade Pact Warlock baseline or something like that. But I think these are the right numbers to be using for the new baseline. And so that ends my damage series. I hope you enjoyed it. Now that I have an idea of the kind of damage that different classes can do, I do think that is going to help me moving forward in terms of character builds. But I don't think I'm going to start with I've just done 3 months of character builds, 39 of them. So I'm probably going to look at some other facets of the rules for the next few videos, but I will get back to damage, of course, at some point. The whole point of this was to get a new baseline and understand the damage potential of various classes. So I'm not going to ignore damage from now on. I'm just, going to be looking at some other stuff. Thanks for everyone who tuned into this series. I hope you learned something as well. Otherwise, until next time, I am going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.